He led a nation through war. The other, he told jokes to survive sleeping in a car. One wore a presidential sash, the other wore a smile that hid decades of pain. But when these two men, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and American icon Steve Harvey, met for the first time, something happened no camera crew, no script, no political advisor could have planned. One kneeled, one wept, and over 10 million people watched, stunned into silence. In a world still bleeding from racism, inequality, and forgotten voices, this was not a headline. It was a heartbeat, a moment when power bent to gratitude, when laughter met legacy, and when two men realized they had been carrying the same pain across different continents. This is not a documentary. This is not historical record. What you're about to hear is a fictional story, crafted from emotion, inspired by truth, and driven by one question. What if your voice, spoken in your darkest hour, could save a life you'd never meet? Now, let's begin. The red on-air sign flickers to life above Studio C, and a familiar ripple of excitement sweeps through the audience bleachers. Floor producers wearing headsets glide across the polished stage like stage hands at a magic show, straightening cue cards and checking the kaleidoscope of LED screens that frame the set. Behind them, the house band teases a bright, brassy riff, part gospel revival, part late-night swagger, that signals the Steve Harvey Show is about to roll. Center stage stands Steve himself, tall, immaculate, and leaning on the confidence of 1,000 punchlines. He's dressed today in a cobalt blue suit that practically hums under the lighting grid. You'd never guess this laughing giant once folded his 6'2" frame into the back seat of a rusted Ford Tempo just to grab a few hours of sleep. But Steve's about to remind everyone, because today's theme is more than survival, and nobody tells that story better. A camera crane swoops over the clapping crowd and locks onto Steve's grin. He winks at the lens, and suddenly the laughter settles into a hush of expectation. "Let me take y'all back," he begins, voice rolling out like warm molasses. 1991, Cleveland, Ohio, cold enough to make a pothole shiver. The audience chuckles, but Steve's eyes carry a flicker of something raw, and the studio instinctively leans forward. He paints the picture. 20-something Steve pacing along Euclid Avenue with a tattered notebook of jokes and exactly $17 in his pocket, trying to decide which luxury he can afford. Dinner or gasoline to reach the next gig. "So I choose gas," he says, shrugging. "Now dinner is a cheeseburger I imagine real hard." The crowd erupts, yet you can feel the edge of the memory, the metal taste of desperation hiding beneath the humor. The follow spot above him glows warmer, as though turning back time. Steve describes sleeping in that Ford with one arm through the steering wheel. "So nobody jacked my ride and me with it." When he wakes, frost on the windshield looks like spider webs of opportunity, each thread leading somewhere he can't see yet. He recites the moment he walked onto a tiny comedy stage in Akron, hands shaking, belly growling, but somehow pulled laughter out of the room like a magician pulls ribbon from thin air. Laughter, he discovered, was worth more than dinner. It could buy hope. The audience roars approval, but the stage lights do something almost imperceptible. They dim for half a heartbeat, then pulse brighter than before. Only the lighting techs notice. They've run this show for years, and that glitch shouldn't happen. In the control booth, a red-haired associate producer frowns at her monitor, tapping a blinking notification no one else can see. It reads, "Incoming satellite feed, origin Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso." But the signals flag priority alpha, higher than any celebrity cameo or sponsor segment. She opens her mouth to alert the director and pauses, sensing this could rewrite the rundown in ways she's not cleared to approve. Down on the floor, Steve's monologue pivots to its punchline lesson. "I learned that night we don't climb out of the dark because someone throws us a rope. We climb because we become the rope." A standing ovation rolls across the bleachers like a human wave. Yet for a split second, Steve blinks, almost startled, as though catching a sound no one else heard. His gaze drifts to the rafters, then to the backstage entrance, where a stagehand with a headset is gesturing in urgent semaphore. Cue cards tremble in the assistant's hands. Sweat darkens her collar. She mouths a single sentence. "It's for you." Steve cocks an eyebrow. This isn't on the schedule, and a quiet drum roll of curiosity begins to beat beneath the laughter. The band members exchange unsure glances, fingers hovering above their instruments. Somewhere in the audience, a woman clutches her purse tighter without knowing why. The director's voice crackles through the studio earpieces. Stand by, potential break. But Steve, ever the ringmaster, decides to roll with it. He steps closer to the edge of the stage, eyes gleaming with a mix of mischief and gravitas. Y'all feel that? He asks the crowd. Something's in the air, and it ain't just my cologne. The joke lands, but tension lingers. Lights sharpen, cameras refocus. The massive LED wall behind Steve flashes a swirling mosaic of golden green, unfamiliar yet regal. Somewhere in the graphic swirl, a crest begins to materialize, along with a line of text no one in the studio can decipher in time. Steve squints, reading silently. His smile falters, just a fracture, yet the audience catches the change and falls eerily quiet, as though the room itself inhales. Every seatback screen in the studio suddenly flickers black, then displays a countdown. 0000010, 00009. The numbers burn white against the darkness. Steve's hand rises, unplanned, palm open toward the cameras, as if to both halt the show and pull viewers even closer. Family, he murmurs, voice dropping to a hush that feels like gospel in the making. I got a feeling this next 10 seconds could stretch all the way across the ocean and right into our hearts. 00003. The house band falls silent. 0000002. Stage lights freeze, trapping dust motes midair like tiny galaxies. 00001. Somewhere out of sight, a satellite locks onto its target. 0. The screen illuminates with a single line in bold capital letters. Message from President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso. And just like that, the world tilts. The studio breathes as one, and every viewer, young or old, rich or poor, realizes they are suddenly part of a story that no cue card ever predicted. It started with a ripple, small, barely visible, a sudden shift in energy, like the moment before a thunderclap. One of the assistant producers, a young woman in black slacks and a headset almost too big for her, sprinted from the wings, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the glossy stage floor. The audience didn't notice at first. Steve Harvey had just finished a joke about growing up in a house so cold, you could see your breath but not your future. The room was still laughing, softening from emotion to amusement, when the assistant reached him. She leaned in quickly, her mouth close to his ear, whispering something that made his brow knot almost instantly. His body stiffened, smile flickering just slightly like a candle in wind. He turned his head toward her, confused. She whispered again, short, urgent, then handed him a small folded paper and stepped back without another word. Steve didn't unfold it. Not yet. He stared down at the paper in his hand like it was a riddle written by fate itself. The audience, picking up on his shift in energy, fell into a hush. The silence wasn't scripted, but it was electric. One of those silences that comes right before something unforgettable. Then the massive LED screen behind him glitched. Just once. A flash. Black, then green, then gold. Every eye turned to it. The swirling pattern morphed, then locked into a golden seal. Bold, official, and unfamiliar. It was accompanied by thick white letters that read, slowly and unmistakably, Message from the President of Burkina Faso. The words hung in the air like thunder still echoing through the clouds. The audience didn't react at first. Many didn't even know where Burkina Faso was. The cameramen hesitated, unsure whether to pan or zoom. The house band looked at each other, hands frozen above their instruments. In the control room, someone muttered, "What the hell is this?" as monitors blinked with a signal override no one had planned for. Steve, for once in his life, looked truly at a loss. He turned slowly toward the screen, then back to the audience, the paper still unopened in his hand. He cleared his throat. Folks, he said, voice lower, slower. I've just been told there's a special message for me. He looked around as if someone else might step in and explain what was happening. From someone I never expected. From, Burkina Faso. He chuckled nervously, a dry, bewildered sound. Burkina. What? A few audience members let out soft, unsure chuckles, but most stayed silent, drawn in by the tension now stretching across the studio like an invisible wire. Steve rubbed the back of his neck. Now look, y'all, I've been surprised live on TV before. I've had my mama show up. I've had exes pop out of the crowd. That got a few laughs. But I ain't never had no president of no country hit me up mid-show. He paused, and in that pause, something changed in his face. Curiosity gave way to something more like concern, even reverence. He finally unfolded the paper in his hand. Inside, only one sentence written in precise cursive. Please remain seated. This is personal. He blinked, read it again. Slowly, almost involuntarily, he moved to the guest chair on stage, usually reserved for interviews. He sat down, back straight, paper in one hand, the other resting on his lap. For the first time in years, the famously quick-witted Steve Harvey had no punchline. The control booth crackled with radio traffic, directors asking each other what to do, legal advisors wondering if this needed clearance. But no one said cut. No one dared. Then the lights dimmed slightly. The screen behind Steve shifted again, away from the official seal to a quiet image. A modest wooden desk, a flag, and a man seated, poised, eyes steady and calm. President Ibrahim Traoré, not behind a podium, not at a press conference, just sitting quietly in a room that looked like it could have belonged to any teacher or father in the world. Steve leaned forward, lips parted slightly, as if trying to read the man's body language before hearing a single word. The room was still, not a cough, not a whisper. And then the president spoke. Steve sat, not because he was told to, but because something inside him shifted, like his legs were suddenly too heavy to hold the weight of what was coming. The studio lights softened, not by design, but as if responding to the change in the air. Every corner of the room, every camera, every breath held still, waiting. The massive screen behind him now displayed a quiet, steady image. A simple room lit by warm daylight, a wooden desk with worn edges, and behind it, the red and green flag of Burkina Faso swaying gently in a breeze that couldn't be heard, only felt. Then came the voice. Steve Harvey, the man began, his accent soft but clear, almost melodic. You don't know me, but I know you. Steve blinked slowly, the words landing like soft stones in still water. His hands clasped in his lap, knuckles white. The voice belonged to President Ibrahim Traoré, not reading a speech, not behind a bulletproof podium, but speaking like one man to another, like a brother. You speak to many, Traoré continued, his eyes steady, unwavering. But today I speak to you, not as a politician, not as a president, but as a boy who once had nothing, and who found hope in your voice. The studio was dead silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. The audience leaned forward as if afraid even blinking would break the moment. In the villages of Burkina Faso, Traoré said, your face is known. Your words are known, not because of your fame, but because of your fire, your faith, your fight. Steve's jaw tightened. His eyes glistened. One foot tapped unconsciously on the stage floor, a silent rhythm of disbelief. I was only a teenager, the president continued, when I sat in a crowded internet cafe, dust in my shoes, war outside our doors, and watched a video of you crying. You weren't acting. You were remembering. You were hurting. And still, you spoke of rising. You told strangers they mattered. Traoré's voice grew heavier, as though he too was reliving something he hadn't meant to revisit. You said, God didn't bring me this far to leave me. And that night, I believed you. A breath caught in Steve's throat. He looked down at the floor, then up at the screen, as if seeing his own life replayed through someone else's memory. When I became a soldier, Traoré said, I carried your words in my heart. Not to fight with anger, but to fight for purpose. When I became a leader, I remembered what you taught me without knowing. That real power isn't loud. It's honest. Steve's lips parted barely, as though to speak, but no words came. Just the shimmering glaze in his eyes. He reached for a tissue on the table beside him, dabbed it once beneath his left eye, and lowered his hand. His shoulders lifted with a deep inhale, like a man trying to hold back a flood with one last sandbag. The president leaned slightly forward in his seat, eyes still locked to the lens. From a soldier who rose to lead his people, he said, to a boy who once slept in a car. He paused. I thank you. And with those 3 words, the dam broke. A single tear slid down Steve Harvey's cheek. The room remained utterly still, but hearts inside it were screaming, pounding, reeling from the weight of what had just begun. Long before the presidential sash rested on his shoulders, Ibrahim Traoré was the barefoot boy everyone in the dusty quarter of Bobo Dioulasso recognized by the rhythm of his stride. He ran everywhere, because running lifted his soles from the scalding earth for a heartbeat at a time, and because the faster he moved, the less his stomach noticed it was empty. Dawn to dusk, the streets sang with the clang of metal basins, the bleat of overworked goats, the low rumble of distant army trucks. Yet the single sound that framed his childhood was the soft slap of calloused feet against red clay. He owned one set of clothes, a sun-bleached shirt, too big and patched at each elbow, and shorts that had surrendered their original color to the Harmattan dust. On his back he carried a bundle of school books, tied together with frayed sisal string. The knot bit into his palm when he walked, but loose pages were a luxury he couldn't afford. The government textbook on algebra still bore the name of a student who had graduated 10 years earlier. Some mornings he slipped pieces of charcoal into the margins, scribbling translations for French terms he barely understood. Other mornings he sold those same charcoal nubs in the market so he and his grandmother could share a bowl of tow before nightfall. Grandmère Adama, stooped but unbreakable, kept a stall at the central marketplace, a patch of shade beneath sagging tarpaulin where she sold dried okra, she-nuts, and hope in equal measure. Ibrahim's first memory of heroism did not involve uniforms or salutes. It was watching her haggle with a stern butcher twice her size and walk away with an extra bone for soup because children cannot grow strong on prices alone. Each afternoon, when the sun struck the corrugated roofs like a hammer, he would slip behind the table and fan the flies away while she rested her swollen knees. He learned math by weighing cowpeas, learned negotiation by staring down tourists who tried to bargain insults into coins, learned pride by sweeping the stall spotless even when he was too tired to stand. War hovered on the horizon like a wildfire no one could see, yet everyone smelled. Some nights artillery echoed from the north, a low thunder that rattled tin doors and dreams alike. When shelling crept closer, families dragged mattresses into narrow corridors, praying the walls would soften shrapnel. Ibrahim remembered curling beside his grandmother, hunger hollowing his belly, counting aftershocks instead of sheep. When the booms grew loud enough to shake the window bars, she would hum a lullaby, a tune older than the border that separated Burkina Faso from everywhere else, and braid her own fear into song so the boy beside her could borrow courage until dawn. In daylight, the war felt distant, almost imaginary, but its fingerprints were everywhere. Empty desks at school, new graves behind the mosque, ration cards stamped until the ink bled through thin paper. Ibrahim's class shrank each term, not from truancy but from families fleeing south. Yet the boy kept walking to class, feet raw, books tighter against his spine, because every lesson promised a bridge out of darkness. He listened as the teacher recited stories of Thomas Sankara and Kwame Nkrumah, men who dreamed nations before they commanded them. And somewhere between the equations and the legends, a seed rooted in his chest. If a farmer's son could redraw a country, why not the grandson of a market woman? One afternoon, after a particularly long queue at the grain depot, Ibrahim perched on an upturned crate beside his grandmother's stall, dust swirling around his ankles like ruddy smoke. He confessed the thought aloud. Yaba, what if one day I help stop this fighting? What if I could change the price of peace so it isn't paid in children? Grandmère Adama examined him with eyes soft as worn leather. She untied her headscarf, dabbed sweat from his brow, and said a single sentence he would carry longer than any textbook. Fasota ye yira yeo. Our land sees those who see her. That night he lay on a reed mat under a sky so bright with stars it felt overcrowded. He imagined classrooms with roofs that didn't leak, villages with wells that never ran dry, soldiers who carried shovels instead of rifles. The dream felt impossible, but hunger and danger had taught him that impossibility was just the first chapter of every true story. So he whispered a vow into the darkness. When the day came that he could write his own pages, he would write for the ones who never learned to read, for the vendors who weighed cow peas by candlelight, for the barefoot children racing shadows down unpaved roads. Children who, like him, deserved a country that did more than survive. The first time Ibrahim saw the inside of an internet cafe, he was 15 and skeptical. It was tucked between a tailor shop and a welding station on a narrow street choked with the buzz of motorbikes and the aroma of fried plantains. The sign above the door read, Cyber Plus, in peeling blue letters, and the windows were taped with faded flyers promising international calls and email access for 200 CFA per hour. The air inside was a strange mix of machine heat and hopeful noise, clicking mice, whispered dreams of visa applications, and the rhythmic hum of a ceiling fan that had seen better days. Ibrahim entered with 2 coins clenched tightly in his fist, wages from helping an elderly man lift sacks of rice earlier that morning. The cafe manager, a man with thick glasses and a sharper tongue, waved him to a cracked swivel chair near the back. The monitor was dusty, the keyboard missing its T, and the connection was slower than gossip on a windless day. But it worked. That was all that mattered. He didn't know what to look for. He had no Facebook, no email, no idea what a browser history was. But curiosity tugged at his sleeve like an impatient sibling. Around him, other boys watched football highlights, giggled at music videos, scrolled through pictures of cities they'd never visit. Ibrahim, unsure, typed USA motivation into the search bar. He had heard somewhere that America had men who spoke to the soul, not just the soldier. The screen paused, refreshed, then flooded with thumbnails, suits and stages, microphones and spotlights, captions promising secrets to success. One title caught his eye, Steve Harvey, Don't Give Up. The thumbnail showed a man crying behind a podium, hand on chest, mouth mid-tremble. It didn't look like motivation. It looked like a moment too raw to fake. He clicked. The video started grainy and slow. Steve's voice cracked from the first sentence, too fast for Ibrahim to catch more than pieces. But he didn't need translation. The tears were real. The pauses were real. This man wasn't speaking from a mountain. He was reaching up from a valley. Ibrahim watched Steve talk about failure, about sleeping in cars, about being told no so many times he thought the word was his name. He saw Steve close his eyes, swallow pain, and still say, God didn't bring me this far to leave me. That line didn't need subtitles. It hit Ibrahim like a shout through fog. He leaned closer to the screen, barely blinking. Something about the tone, the gravel of sorrow mixed with the steel of survival, wrapped around his chest. This man, this stranger with a mustache and a suit, was crying in front of thousands and not flinching. Ibrahim didn't understand every word, but he understood every silence. Every time Steve paused to find breath was a message in itself. You're still breathing? That means you're still fighting. By the time the video ended, Ibrahim's hands were trembling slightly on the desk. Not out of fear, out of recognition. For the first time in his life, he saw poverty mirrored on a screen, not as shame, but as proof of endurance. He saw a man survive being invisible and turn it into something seen by millions. He sat there long after the video finished, long after the time on his session expired and the screen faded to black. The cafe manager called out to him twice before he responded. When he finally stood, he walked out of the cyber cafe a little taller, not because the ground had changed, but because something inside him had straightened. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed without apology, but Ibrahim didn't blink. He turned toward home with his books tied to his back, same as always, but now the weight felt different. As he passed the welding station, sparks flew upward like fireflies, and he whispered under his breath, I won't give up. The phrase tasted foreign on his tongue, but powerful. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a sentence he had waited his whole life to hear, even if it came in a language he barely understood. The years that followed did not get easier, but they got clearer. Ibrahim Traoré, once just the boy with dust-caked heels and second-hand books, began to forge his path with a quiet determination that unsettled even his teachers. He studied with the intensity of someone trying to decode survival. By candlelight, under leaky roofs, beside his grandmother's sleeping form, he memorized formulas and traced the geography of nations he'd never seen. His notebooks became confessionals filled not just with facts, but with questions. What is justice? Why do some children carry rifles instead of pencils? Who decides who matters? When he graduated secondary school, a local commander came to recruit from his district. Most boys signed up for the stipend, the uniform, the illusion of control. But Ibrahim walked into that office not to escape poverty, but to confront it from the inside. He joined the military, not for power, but for perspective. The discipline suited him. The hardship didn't frighten him. He had slept through artillery as a child. Waking at dawn for drills was just a different kind of thunder. In boot camp, while others folded pictures of girlfriends into their pockets, Ibrahim folded a slip of paper he had printed the day he left for training. A single quote from the man who unknowingly lit his path. God didn't bring me this far to leave me. Below it, scrawled in pencil, he had written, purpose over title. It became a mantra, a compass he recited silently before each mission, each decision. His rise through the ranks wasn't flashy, but it was relentless. He volunteered for the difficult posts, border zones, supply lines, regions abandoned by policy but plagued by insurgency. His leadership was practical. Walk with your men, listen before you speak, eat only after your soldiers have eaten. Rumors of his style spread faster than his name. They called him Le Capitaine qui marche pieds nus, the captain who walks barefoot, a nod to the boy he had never fully stopped being. By the time he returned to the capital, promotion followed not because he asked, but because others insisted. He was offered a political liaison role, temporary, symbolic, but he used it as a doorway. He entered meetings silent and left with plans. He listened to elders, questioned ministers, and refused to be the kind of leader who used air conditioning to ignore suffering. When a government collapse left a vacuum of leadership, it was Ibrahim who stepped forward, not with a clenched fist, but with a hand raised. His campaign was simple: dignity, reform, and action. His enemies underestimated his quiet voice. They didn't realize it carried the weight of every voiceless child he'd ever known. And so he became president. But he never moved into the grand office. Instead, he chose a modest chamber in the old Parliament building, the one that still bore bullet scars from past revolutions. On his desk, among folders and reports, sat a weathered letter encased in a small glass frame. The same printout from years ago, edges faded, ink slightly smudged. It was the quote from Steve Harvey, and it stayed there, not as decoration, but as reminder. That desk bore the signatures of diplomats, the weight of military decisions, and the burden of a nation's future. But at its heart was a line from a stranger who had unknowingly taught a boy in Africa that sometimes the most powerful titles begin with pain, and that the only authority worth having is the kind rooted in purpose, not position. Every morning before opening a briefing or answering a call, Ibrahim would glance at that letter, nod once to himself, and silently say, purpose over title. Back in the studio, time had slowed to a hush so complete it felt sacred. You could hear the soft hum of the lights, the faint creak of a seat shifting as someone leaned forward, even the shallow breaths of a cameraman holding his focus too long. Steve Harvey sat motionless in the guest chair, hands clasped, eyes locked on the massive screen that had, just moments ago, turned from backdrop to lifeline. His usual charisma, that warm energy that lit up rooms effortlessly, had drained from his face, not in fear, but in reverence. On the screen, President Ibrahim Traoré sat still, his eyes focused not just on the lens, but on Steve, as if speaking directly to the space behind his ribs, the kind of gaze that stripped away titles, fame, even miles. It was a conversation across continents, but it felt as intimate as two men sitting on a porch under fading light. The president's voice, slow and deliberate, echoed through the studio like prayer. "You cried for others," Traoré said softly, "and now I cry for you." The words didn't come with drama. There was no music swell, no swelling score in the background, but the moment landed like thunder in the soul. You could feel it, rippling through the chest of every person in the room, vibrating against their own memories of grief, of endurance, of unseen battles. A woman in the second row clutched a tissue to her mouth. A man in the back removed his glasses, blinking too quickly. Somewhere off camera, a stagehand froze with a mic in hand, tears quietly slipping down his cheek. And Steve, he didn't move. His hands, once tapping softly on the armrest, had gone still. His lips parted slightly, as if caught between speaking and breathing. His eyes glistened, unblinking, fixated not on the face of a politician, but on something far older, deeper. Recognition, pain, honor. "You taught us," Traoré continued, "that vulnerability is not weakness, that when a man weeps, it is not because he's broken, but because he still feels. And when you wept on stage, not for yourself, but for the people the world had forgotten, we saw something the world rarely shows. A man with power, using it to comfort, not control." A quiet sob echoed from the back of the studio. No one turned to look. No one needed to. The tears weren't disruptive. They were part of the moment, part of the weight being carried and shared. Steve leaned forward an inch, not by choice but by gravity, as if the words were pulling him closer. His throat moved, trying to form a response, but nothing came. His body language, so often filled with bold gestures and commanding presence, had softened into something almost childlike. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from shock, but from being seen so clearly it takes your breath away. "Your voice," Traoré said, "reached us even when we did not understand the words. Because pain, real pain, has no accent. It needs no translation." The president paused for a beat. Not a dramatic pause, but one to gather his breath, as if the memory were too heavy to carry all at once. "When war came close to my village," he said, "and we hid in silence, we played one of your videos in a small room with just one speaker, no subtitles, no internet, just you, crying, and still standing. And we stood too." Steve exhaled sharply, almost a gasp. He raised a hand to his mouth and lowered it again. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply watched, as if watching something sacred unfold, something human, something rare. "For years," Traoré added, "you cried for strangers, for lost sons, for widows, for children without names. Today I cry for the man who reminded us we were never truly forgotten." Steve's eyes brimmed. The dam hadn't broken, but it had cracked. He looked up at the screen again, and for the first time in his career, after thousands of interviews, punchlines, and life stories, he was speechless. And in that silence, the studio wept with him. Not because it was sad, but because it was real. The image of President Traoré still filled the studio screen, his eyes steady and his posture firm. But now there was something different in his tone. It was no longer the voice of a world leader giving tribute. It had softened, lowered, become more intimate, as if what he was about to say was not meant for the crowd, nor the cameras, but for Steve Harvey alone. He leaned slightly closer to the camera, and the studio lights dimmed almost imperceptibly, like the room itself was bowing in anticipation. "Mr. Harvey," he said gently, "I know your life is filled with lights, with noise, with headlines and handshakes, but I ask something simple of you today, not as a celebrity, not as a guest, but as a brother." There was a pause, a breath. "Come to Burkina Faso." The words settled over the room like fresh snow, soft but undeniable. Steve blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Come to Burkina Faso?" It wasn't a media invitation. It wasn't a speech opportunity or award ceremony. It sounded personal. Traoré continued, "Not for cameras, not for attention, but for connection." A long silence followed, filled only by the faint hum of studio equipment and the sound of someone quietly sniffling in the third row. I know what you're thinking, the president said. Why? Why fly across the ocean to a place most people can't find on a map? Why walk into the heat, the dust, the quiet corners of the world where your name is still known, but never spoken on television? He let the question hang, and then answered it himself. Because there are children here who know your name, Steve. Children who pray with your words, who fall asleep to your voice, played over a speaker that barely works, in a place with no television, no father, and sometimes no food. Steve's eyes began to well. He gripped the arm of his chair, suddenly aware of how small the studio felt compared to the space those words reached into. The image of children in a village far away, whispering his name, not because of fame, but because of comfort, hit him with a force he wasn't prepared for. There is a small orphanage in Ouagadougou, Traoré said, where they wait for your videos every week like sermons. They laugh when you laugh. They cry when you cry. They repeat your words like scripture. To them, you are not a host. You are hope. Steve closed his eyes. A tear slipped down his cheek, tracing the path of old memories. Nights he slept in a car. Nights he prayed for a sign that his voice mattered. That someone, somewhere, was listening. Now, years later, the answer had come not in applause or ratings, but in the quiet voices of children an ocean away. The president's voice, now nearly a whisper, said, "They do not want your autograph. They only want to see the man who made them believe they matter." Steve opened his eyes, glassy and full. He nodded slightly, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment, to the truth of it. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care that he had cried. He didn't care that for once he had no clever line to break the tension. Traoré sat back in his chair and said one final thing, softly like a closing benediction. "Come, Steve, not to be seen, but to see." The screen faded to black, and for a moment, Steve Harvey, so often the voice of the room, sat in complete silence. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because the only answer worthy of that invitation couldn't be spoken with words, only with footsteps. The studio was quiet long after the screen faded to black. No applause, no music. Just the weight of what had just happened settling into every corner of the room like dust after a storm. Steve sat still in the chair, staring not at the cameras or the audience, but at something only he could see. Something behind his eyes, somewhere deep in the folds of memory. His fingers lightly traced the edge of the chair's armrest as if grounding himself, anchoring the man he had become to the boy he used to be. He had heard 1,000 stories in his life, stories of heartbreak, of triumph, of loss, but none had ever bent him inward like this. It wasn't the grandeur of a president's words or the political symbolism of a foreign leader reaching across oceans. It was something far simpler, far heavier, the realization that his voice had traveled further than he ever walked, that words spoken in pain, in loneliness, had planted hope where no spotlight had ever shone. He remembered the exact prayer. He was 32, broke, living out of a beat-up car with a cracked windshield and an engine that coughed like an old man. He had just been told again that he wasn't funny enough, not marketable enough, not network safe. That night, parked behind a Waffle House off Interstate 20, he had looked up at the stars through the frost on his window and whispered into the silence, "God, if I ever make it, let my voice mean something. Not just laughs, something real. Let it help somebody." He hadn't thought about that prayer in years, but now as the studio lights dimmed around him and staff hesitated to speak, it came rushing back with the clarity of prophecy. The boy from Cleveland, who once begged God for purpose, had been called, not by agents or sponsors, but by a child across the sea who heard his laughter and believed it meant she mattered. One of the producers stepped forward cautiously, a clipboard in hand. "Steve, we can cut to commercial, or we can wrap the segment as a tribute. You just say the word." Steve turned slowly. His voice was hoarse, quiet, but clear. "Don't cut anything." He paused, then stood, still steadying himself. "We're not editing this. The world needed to see it raw, just like it happened." The producer nodded, then hesitated again. "Do you want to issue a response on social media? We could—" "No," Steve interrupted more firmly this time. "No press, no cameras, no headlines. He looked directly at her. Book the flight. Her eyebrows rose. Flight? Steve nodded once, more to himself than anyone else. To Burkina Faso. The producer blinked, stunned. You're serious? As death, Steve said softly, a slight smile breaking through. And this time, I ain't going for ratings. I'm going because something in me won't let me stay here. She opened her mouth to speak again, but he had already turned, stepping off the stage slowly, deliberately. The band stayed silent. The audience watched, many still wiping tears. No music played him out. The cameras, still rolling, captured his silhouette as he reached the studio doors. And just before he exited, he paused, looked up toward the rafters as if listening for something invisible, and whispered, "Okay, I hear you." The final shot lingered not on Steve, but through the lens of a camera pulling back, until the studio looked small beneath the dark rafters and quiet rigging above. The frame shifted again, this time to the night sky beyond the studio, endless and deep. Stars blinked into view, scattered across the heavens, quiet witnesses to the vow being answered. And far beyond them, across land and sea, a little girl named Acha clutched a notebook to her chest, waiting. The hum of the private jet was steady, almost meditative, as it sliced through clouds thousands of feet above the Atlantic. Steve Harvey sat alone by the window, the shades drawn halfway to allow slivers of moonlight to trace soft silver patterns across his suit sleeve. The leather seat cradled him, but he sat upright, his posture not one of comfort, but of contemplation. In his lap was a folded letter, edges slightly bent from being opened, and read too many times in too few hours. It was written in blue ink on lined paper, the penmanship neat but youthful, careful but full of urgency. The words didn't run long, less than a page, but they echoed inside Steve's chest as though he'd swallowed them whole. His fingers ran across the line he had already read a dozen times and would read again. I wish my mother could have seen the man you helped me become. Acha, 10 years old, an orphan, a believer. The plane cabin was quiet, save for the faint rumble of engines and the occasional shuffle of the flight attendant preparing tea Steve hadn't requested. He needed nothing right now. No food, no drink, no distraction. Only this letter, and the memories it brought rushing back. His eyes drifted from the paper to the dark sky beyond the window, but he didn't really see the stars. What he saw was Cleveland, Ohio, winter of '84. He was 17, broke and hungry in a way no comedy could fix. The house had no heat. His shoes had holes. His coat was a hand-me-down of a hand-me-down, more thread than fabric. He remembered coming home to find the electricity shut off, his mother boiling water on the stove to create steam and trick the cold into thinking it didn't live there. He remembered her voice, steady even when her body trembled from exhaustion, telling him, "You gon' be somebody, baby. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you were born for something." He never fully believed her back then, not until years later. But tonight, high above the ocean, with a letter from a little girl in Africa tucked into his palm, he felt her words like heat, the kind that warms not just the body, but the spirit. He unfolded the letter again, eyes lingering on every stroke. Acha had written about her father, lost to illness, and her mother, too sick to speak some days. She wrote about nights where dinner was silence, and days where laughter was borrowed from memories. And then she mentioned him. Not as a star, not as a famous man, but as a voice, a presence that reached across static and hunger and made her feel, if only for a moment, that she wasn't invisible. Steve felt something catch in his chest, part ache, part awe. How could something he said in a suit on a studio stage land in the heart of a child with no electricity, halfway across the world? How many times had he made people laugh just to keep from crying? And now those tears, unshed, unspoken, had traveled like signals in the dark and wrapped themselves around a girl who needed light. He whispered to no one, "You helped me become someone too, baby girl." The flight attendant approached quietly, offered him a cup of ginger tea. He nodded politely, took it with one hand while the other never left the letter. He sipped once, then placed the cup down on the side table. Still looking out the window, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out an old photo. Creases worn deep, edges faded. It was his mother standing outside the church, smiling with the weight of sacrifice in her eyes. He pressed the photo to his lips, then folded it into the letter from Acha and tucked both into the inside pocket of his jacket. This journey wasn't about charity. It wasn't even about closure. It was something deeper, something sacred. Steve leaned back in his seat, eyes heavy, heart full. As the plane cruised through the dark, he closed his eyes and whispered the only prayer he needed. Let me be exactly the man she thinks I am. Outside, the stars blinked like 1,000 watching eyes, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness to a promise made. Not in lights or fame, but in the quiet, tender flight of a man returning to the purpose he once begged for. The wheels of the plane touched down with a gentle thud, kicking up a fine mist of dust across the weathered tarmac. There was no press pool waiting, no flashing lights or extended microphones, no banners, no podium, no motorcade. Just a golden African sunrise spilling itself across the horizon like warm honey, and a breeze that carried the scent of earth, charcoal, and distant mango trees. Through the cabin window, Steve Harvey saw a simple wooden sign being held by a tall, slender young man in a white linen shirt. The sign, hand-painted in neat block letters, read, "Welcome, Brother Steve." The plane door opened, and the air hit different. Not stale and recycled like on sets or studios, but alive, thick with heat, yes, but also with memory. Steve stepped down the metal stairs slowly, his polished shoes pressing against cracked pavement. He paused for a moment at the bottom, looking around. He wasn't met with fanfare, only faces. Quiet, curious, warm. Two aides stood nearby, both in traditional cloth. One nodded with a soft smile, then gestured toward a modest black SUV. The drive from the airport to the orphanage was wordless, not out of discomfort, but out of respect for the silence that felt strangely sacred. Through the windows, Steve watched as the city unfolded, not in luxury, but in life. Markets brimming with fruit and chatter, barefoot children chasing tires down dusty alleys, women balancing buckets with regal posture, motorbikes zipping between goats. Life was happening everywhere, not behind screens, but in sun and sweat and survival. The SUV turned off the main road and followed a narrow dirt path flanked by tall grass and a few low trees. At the end of the path stood a small cement building with faded paint and a corrugated tin roof. The gate was open. Inside, dozens of children stood in quiet rows, holding handmade signs and drawings that fluttered softly in the morning breeze. As the car rolled to a stop, one of the aides gently opened the door. Steve stepped out slowly, eyes adjusting to the bright light. The children didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just stood there, watching, smiling, waiting. He walked forward, unsure of what to say, until he noticed a large canvas propped up on two bricks near the building entrance. It was a painting, rough, colorful, childlike, and deeply sincere. On it was him, Steve Harvey, smiling, arms open, surrounded by children beneath a tree. The likeness was imperfect, the lines uneven, but the feeling was unmistakable. He froze. His throat tightened. The image didn't show the TV host or the comedian. It showed the man they believed he was, the man he had always hoped to be. One of the children, a boy no older than 7, stepped forward. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but clear as a bell. "You are the one who speaks to the sky," he said in French accented English. And the sky, it listened. Steve's knees almost gave. He knelt, not for effect, not because it was expected, but because it was the only thing his body knew to do in that moment. He pressed a hand gently to his chest, then to the boy's shoulder, nodding, words still lost somewhere between his lungs and lips. Behind them, the children began to hum a tune, a slow, rhythmic melody that wrapped around the courtyard like a lullaby. It wasn't rehearsed or theatrical. It was homegrown, born of quiet gratitude. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, and in that hum, he heard echoes of something familiar. Something his own grandmother once sang when times were hard. This wasn't a welcome like he'd known before. This was something ancient, something sacred, a receiving not of status, but of spirit. And in that moment, Steve Harvey, the man who had spent a lifetime commanding stages, stood still in front of a cracked wall, a child's drawing, in a choir of tiny voices, and felt, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to arrive. The courtyard grew quiet, the humming faded into the warm breeze, and then the children slowly parted like a tide drawing back from the shore. In the center of that newly formed path stood a little girl, small, delicate, her frame barely filling the simple yellow dress she wore. Her feet were dusty, her braids tied with mismatched ribbons, and in her trembling hands she held a small folded piece of paper. Steve saw her before she even moved. Somehow he knew it was her. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, not with awe but with something deeper. Recognition, like they'd met before in another life, or maybe in a shared dream born of struggle. She stepped forward slowly, the letter clutched tightly against her chest. Her shoulders rose and fell with shallow breaths, and her eyes, though wide and dark, held a storm of courage trying to break through fear. Steve stood frozen as she reached him. He didn't speak. He didn't kneel yet. He waited. He let her take the lead. And when she finally stopped in front of him, she looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "This is for you," she said. Her hands trembled as she lifted the letter toward him. Steve didn't take it right away. He stared at her for a heartbeat longer, something inside his chest crumbling gently. Then, with hands just as unsteady, he knelt down to meet her eye to eye. The ground beneath him was warm, solid, and real. So real it seemed to pulse with everything this moment meant. He took the letter, unfolded it carefully, reverently. It was handwritten in the same neat but fragile script he remembered from the copy given to him on the plane. But this was the original. The ink slightly smudged in places, a tiny fingerprint on the corner, the final line underlined in soft blue pencil. "Dear Mr. Steve, my papa died 2 years ago. My mom is sick. Sometimes I cry at night. But one day someone played your video. You said you were born to do something great. I believed you. Thank you for speaking to us, even if you didn't know we were listening. I hope you smile when you see us. Your little sister, Acha." Steve's lips quivered. His chest rose with a jagged breath, then fell. And then he broke. Not politely, not quietly, but openly. The kind of crying that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with being overwhelmed by truth. His shoulders shook. The letter fluttered slightly in his hands, and in front of him Acha stood still, watching the tears fall from the man whose voice had once held her through the darkest of nights. Then wordlessly, Steve opened his arms, and she stepped in. The embrace was gentle but powerful. His arms wrapped around her like a shield, hers folded across his ribs like a question finally answered. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. In that courtyard, with sunlight pouring over cracked walls and hand-painted murals, time stood still. The other children didn't speak. The staff didn't move. The courtyard held its breath. And in the silence, only the wind remained, rustling leaves carrying memory, stitching two broken stories into one whole moment. Steve held her close, pressing his cheek against the top of her head, whispering only one word through the sobs. "Thank you." The next morning arrived not with fanfare, but with the soft rustle of wind through mango trees and the distant sound of laughter drifting from the orphanage courtyard. Steve had slept little. His mind spun with too much. Acha's trembling hands, the quiet weight of her letter, the song the children sang, the way his own tears had surprised him. But when the knock came on his door, gentle and respectful, he was already dressed. Outside, waiting under the shade of a crooked neem tree, stood President Ibrahim Traoré, not in a suit or ceremonial robe, but in a simple white tunic and sandals, his sleeves rolled up, his expression calm but unreadable. No motorcade waited, just a small, dusty truck and a driver humming softly to himself. Traoré gestured toward the passenger side with a slight smile. "There's somewhere I want to take you," he said. They drove in silence for a while, through the winding back roads of Ouagadougou, past children walking in pairs with plastic jugs, past women sweeping storefronts with straw brooms, past life unfolding in its own unhurried rhythm. Steve watched it all, his eyes scanning every corner, his thoughts quiet. This was not the Africa from headlines or travel brochures. It was intimate, textured, alive. After half an hour, the truck pulled up beside a row of low-metal stalls, many of them rusted and empty. It wasn't market day, but the place still carried the smell of spices and smoke, and the soft echoes of haggling that seemed to linger in the walls. A few vendors sat on overturned crates, fanning themselves lazily, watching the newcomers with mild curiosity. Traoré stepped out first, leading Steve toward the far end of the market, weaving through crooked rows of stands. Eventually, he stopped in front of one particular stall, a simple wooden table under a sagging canvas sheet. Its surface was cracked and warped with age, the edges darkened from decades of touch. A few rusty hooks still hung from the side. The ground beneath was swept clean, as if someone still cared for the space even after it had been abandoned. Traoré placed a hand on the table's edge. His voice was quiet. "This," he said, "was my beginning." Steve didn't speak. He didn't need to. The weight in the air was enough. "My grandmother sat here every day," Traoré continued, his fingers trailing across the weathered wood. "She sold dried fish, onions, millet. She never learned to read, but she could count better than any banker. She knew the price of everything, especially pride." Steve felt something tighten in his chest. He stepped closer, looking at the stall not as an object, but as a memory carved into the earth. "I used to sit right here," Traoré said, pointing to a spot beside the table. "On a wooden crate. I'd fan flies away, stack vegetables, listen to her hum. When there was no business, she'd listen to an old radio. Static half the time, but sometimes your voice came through. She didn't understand English, but she understood your heart." Steve looked down, swallowing hard. In that moment, the image of his own grandmother bloomed in his mind. He could see her, back in Cleveland, standing in the kitchen with a wooden spoon, her voice humming gospel, while steam rose from a pot of beans. He remembered the smell of cornbread, the worn slippers on her feet, the way she'd touch his cheek when he cried and say, "You got a lion in you, baby. You just don't hear him roar yet." He blinked, and the market came back into focus. "She told me," Traoré said, "that one day I would lead, not because I was special, but because I knew what struggle smelled like." Steve exhaled slowly. Then gently, he placed his hand on the same corner of the table Traoré had touched. No words, just skin to wood, past to present. After a long silence, Traoré reached down and picked up a small stone from the ground beneath the stall. He turned to Steve, placed it in his palm, and closed his fingers around it. "This is yours now," he said. "So you remember, not all foundations are made of marble. Some are built right here, in the dust." Steve didn't answer, but his eyes did, and together they stood beneath the worn canvas roof of a forgotten market stall. Two men from different worlds, sharing a beginning neither had spoken of until now. After leaving the old market stall, Steve and President Traoré walked along a narrow dirt path that curved gently behind the vendor rows. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden light across the corrugated rooftops and turning every particle of dust into tiny sparks in the air. The market had mostly quieted, save for the occasional laugh or the thump of a basket being lowered. A few goats wandered freely, unbothered by the presence of two men who had once been boys of burden. They stopped in front of a low, faded house with clay walls and a rusting tin roof. Outside, under the shade of a weathered mango tree, sat an elderly woman wrapped in layers of soft, floral fabric. Her back was curved like a question mark, but her eyes were sharp, glinting with memory. Her hands, dark and veined like riverbeds, rested gently in her lap. "This is Awa," Traoré said, lowering his voice. "She used to sit beside my grandmother at the market. Every day. She's the last one left who remembers those mornings. She asked to see you." Steve approached slowly, his steps cautious. There was something sacred in Awa's stillness, as though time itself paused for her convenience. She looked up as he neared, her gaze locking with his in a way that felt like she was peeling back not just the years, but the masks, the layers, the titles. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and pressed her palm to Steve's cheek. Her skin was dry and warm, like sun-baked earth. Her touch wasn't heavy, but it held the weight of generations. She looked at him for a long time, studying the lines on his face, the sadness behind his eyes, the surprise he still carried in his chest. Then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and spoke in Moray, her voice soft but rooted. Traoré stepped forward and translated gently. She says, her sister would have called you son. The words hit Steve like a wave. His breath caught, his lips parted, but nothing came out. Just the sound of the wind rustling the tree above them, and a low growing hum in his ears. Awa's hand didn't leave his face. Instead, she began to stroke his cheek, the way grandmothers do when they want to say everything without speaking. She says, Traoré continued, voice low, that her sister would have cooked for you, sat you down, fed you twice, once for your hunger and once for your wounds. Steve's vision blurred, his knees wobbled, and then he dropped, gracefully, without resistance, onto the dirt at her feet. He wasn't trying to make a statement. His body simply responded to something deeper than logic. He wept openly, not like a man ashamed of tears, but like someone who had finally been allowed to collapse into a kind of love he never expected to find again. His forehead touched the edge of her skirt. Awa placed her hand on his head, murmuring something soft and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. A few neighbors watched from nearby, but no one intruded. They had seen this kind of moment before. Not often, but enough to know when the soul was being rewoven. When Steve finally looked up, his face damp, his voice raw, he whispered, She really would have? Traoré didn't need to ask Awa again. He simply nodded. Yes, he said. She would have seen you the way you are? Not the man on television, the boy, the fighter. The son. Steve closed his eyes. For a few seconds, he simply breathed. Awa leaned forward, her knees cracking slightly, and pressed her forehead gently to his. She says, Traoré added, translating one final time, you have always belonged here. We just had to remind you. And in that quiet corner of a forgotten neighborhood, under a mango tree that had seen more laughter than loss, Steve Harvey knelt like a child rediscovering home. Not a place, but a presence. Not a moment, but a memory he never lived, and yet somehow always carried. That night, the air over the orphanage was thick with warmth and memory. The courtyard was dimly lit by hanging lanterns made of repurposed tin and colored glass, casting soft hues across the cracked walls and worn stone tiles. The children had gathered again, this time in a semicircle beneath the old mango tree, their faces glowing not with performance nerves but with a quiet joy, an anticipation that something sacred was about to unfold. Steve sat in the front row beside President Traoré, both of them now dressed in light traditional tunics, their hands resting on their laps, their expressions unreadable but attentive. The night had been planned by the children and their caretakers, not as a spectacle, but as a gift. No cameras, no lights, just voices, just truth. One of the older girls stepped forward first, no more than 12, and without introduction, she began to hum. The sound was soft, slow, and hauntingly familiar. Within seconds, the rest of the children joined in, layer by layer, until the courtyard was filled with a melody that wrapped around everyone like a shawl woven from memory. The song was in Moray, gentle, rhythmic, rooted. The syllables rose and fell like waves, pulsing with something that felt older than language itself. Steve's brow furrowed. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing, listening not just with his ears, but with the part of him that stored echoes from a time before fame, before struggle had a name. His lips parted. The notes weren't just familiar. They were known, from somewhere long buried. He turned slowly to Traoré. The president was already watching him. Steve leaned in, his voice a whisper. Wait, this melody, I've heard this. Traoré didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked forward again, nodding once, slowly. Yes, he said, you have. Steve stared at the children, the song now in full bloom, delicate yet powerful. And then it hit him. Not like thunder, but like the hush that follows it. He remembered lying on a sagging mattress in Cleveland, a little boy clutching a worn stuffed bear, while his grandmother stroked his hair and hummed that very same tune. The words had been different, English, perhaps a gospel reinterpretation, but the melody, the core, the soul of it was identical. He gasped, hand rising instinctively to his chest. Traoré turned to him again. "My grandmother sang it to me," he said softly. "Every night the soldiers came close. Every time we had no food, she'd hum that song and tell me, 'If you listen close, it'll carry you to morning.'" Steve's eyes filled. "My grandma," he whispered, "used to say the same thing. I thought she made it up." Traoré smiled, his gaze distant now, as if following the song into the past. "Maybe she did, and maybe they both did." Steve leaned back in his chair, looking up toward the stars now peeking through the night sky. The children sang on, their eyes closed, swaying gently in rhythm. The notes fluttered like fireflies through the air, brushing across the years, across oceans, across generations. "Our grandmothers," Steve said, the words catching in his throat. "They sang the same lullaby." Traoré didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them was full of wonder, of understanding, of something passed down not through blood, but through love that defied borders. In that moment, neither man was a public figure. They were just grandsons, wrapped in the same song that once kept them warm when the world felt cold. And somewhere, maybe, two old women smiled from opposite ends of the sky, each knowing their voice had found a home in more than one heart. The morning sun was still soft, casting long golden beams through the branches of the mango trees as Steve and President Traoré stood quietly beside a dirt path that wound just outside the edge of the village. The air was cooler here, kissed with dew, and the only sounds were the chirps of birds overhead and the occasional breeze brushing gently through the tall grass. It was peaceful, so peaceful that Steve almost didn't notice the small parcel of land they had stopped in front of. It wasn't grand. There were no gates, no markers, no sign of ownership. Just open soil, a few flat stones arranged in a half circle, and one tall, solitary mango tree at the center, its leaves flickering like green fire under the rising sun. Traoré reached into a leather folder and pulled out a rolled certificate bound with a red ribbon. He handed it to Steve without a word. Steve stared at the scroll for a moment, then slowly untied the ribbon. The paper inside was thick, parchment-like. His eyes skimmed over the printed words, French, then English. It was official. A deed, a legal transfer. A small piece of Burkina Faso now belonged to him. He blinked, unsure if he understood. "What is this?" he asked, the words dry in his throat. Traoré's voice was calm, but firm with sincerity. "This land is yours." Steve looked up, confusion plain on his face. "Mine?" Traoré nodded, stepping toward the tree. "My grandmother used to say that every man needs a place in this world that expects nothing from him. No audience, no stage, no demands, just peace. This is that place for you." Steve stared at the earth beneath his feet, as if it had suddenly taken on new meaning. The soil was red and warm. The tree above him swayed gently, as if in acknowledgement. I didn't come here for this," Steve stammered. "I didn't do anything to deserve—" Traoré raised a hand. "You came. You listened. You made my people feel seen. That is more than enough." Steve stepped forward, placing a hand against the mango tree's bark. It was rough and cool to the touch. He leaned into it slightly, closing his eyes. A breeze passed through, rustling the leaves above him in a soft whisper, like a voice too ancient to name. He whispered more to himself than anyone, "A place of peace." Traoré spoke again, gently. "You've spent your life giving, through laughter, through hope. But peace, real peace, can't be given. It has to be accepted." Steve turned back to the president, his voice low. "Why here?" Traoré looked around them. "Because this land remembers. It remembers struggle. It remembers growth. Just like you. This tree was planted by a farmer who had nothing. It has survived droughts, storms, fire, but it still stands, still gives fruit. Like you." Steve felt the weight of it all pressing into his chest. The letter from Akka, the touch of Awa's hand, the song under the mango tree. And now, this. He looked down at the deed again, then back at the soil, the tree, the quiet horizon stretching out before him. Slowly, reverently, he knelt, pressing his palm into the earth, not to claim it, but to feel it. I don't know what to say, he whispered. You don't have to, Traoré replied. This land will speak for you. And for a long moment, the two men stood in silence, no longer as guest and host or even as public figures, but as sons of different worlds bound by something deeper than blood. Here on this patch of sunlit soil, Steve Harvey had been given no throne, no riches, no stage, but he had been given something rarer, a home. The wind shifted gently through the mango branches above, carrying with it a silence so full, so sacred it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Steve stood still beneath the tree, the deed to the land clutched loosely in his hand, the soil still fresh against his knees from moments before. He looked up to thank Traoré, but the words froze, because Traoré was no longer standing. The president of Burkina Faso had quietly, solemnly lowered himself onto one knee, his head bowed, his hand placed gently over his chest. The air around them trembled, not from noise but from the sheer gravity of the gesture. I do not kneel for crowns, Traoré said softly. I kneel for hearts that carry others, hearts like yours. Steve's breath hitched. No applause, no cameras, no orchestras swelling in the background. Just this, one man honoring another in the oldest way known to humankind. Without hesitation, Steve knelt too. Across the soil, across two paths carved by hardship, the two men bowed their heads and let the weight of memory, loss, and grace wash over them. No longer a president or a celebrity, just two sons of women who had once hummed the same lullaby beneath different stars. And they wept. Steve Harvey's return to the United States was quiet, deliberately so. No press conference, no media circus, no interviews. Just a black SUV pulling up behind the studio, a familiar back door creaking open, and a man walking in. Not with the swagger of a star, but with the steady steps of someone who had just left a sacred place behind. When his show resumed that week, the audience expected jokes, the usual energy, the rhythm of laughter they'd come to love. The lights dimmed, the theme music played, and Steve walked on stage. But something was different. In his hands, he carried a small wooden sculpture, delicate, simple, and beautiful. Two hands carved together, cradling a heart. It wasn't polished gold or glass, no inscription, just truth in form. Without a word, Steve walked to his desk, placed the sculpture gently in the center, and stood behind it. The studio held its breath. Then, in a voice lower and steadier than ever before, Steve simply said, "This was the greatest award I ever got." The crowd didn't cheer. They couldn't. Instead, silence swept the room, a reverent, aching silence. And for a moment, every person watching knew something had changed in him, forever. Steve returned to his show, but this time there was no punchline. He stood beside the small wooden sculpture of two hands cradling a heart and pressed play. The lullaby in moire filled the studio. No subtitles, just voices, pure, innocent, echoing across the world. The audience was silent. At home, millions paused. The YouTube live chat flooded with one word: healed. Thousands, then millions. Steve looked into the camera, voice low. Sometimes the echo of your voice finds a heart you never knew was listening, and when it does, it changes everything. Days later, Steve received one final letter from Traoré. One line stood out. My grandmother smiled, not because she understood you, but because she felt you. Steve sat back, tears in his eyes. Years ago, he had whispered a prayer in a car. If I ever get famous, let my words help someone. Now, halfway across the world, a nation had answered. He placed the letter beside Aka's note, then smiled. The prayer had not only reached someone, it had come back home. Years later, Aka stood in her classroom, now a teacher. On her desk sat a faded photo. Steve, Traoré, and dozens of laughing children. Every year, she told a story. A man from America came, not to be seen, but to see us. Nearby, the mango tree still stood, bigger, stronger, feeding villages with its fruit. A small wooden sign at its base read, "Place of Peace, planted by purpose." And when the wind passed through the leaves at dusk, it still carried a lullaby, the one that crossed oceans, healed hearts, and never needed translation. The mango tree still grows. This story shows us that true impact doesn't come from status, but from the heart. A simple message, born from struggle, crossed oceans and healed lives. When two men from different worlds knelt not in power, but in shared pain and purpose, the world stood still. It reminds us, kindness echoes farther than we think. So let me ask you, what story is your life quietly telling? And who might be listening? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth. Subscribe now. Your curiosity fuels the next story.